In today's video, I want to give you a very in-depth look at what it truly takes to close a six-figure software deal selling business to business. And this is based on a true story of when I sold a database to one of the fastest growing e-commerce companies in the United States. And I might add, at the time, I was working at a 300-person startup, and we beat out some of the biggest names in the industry, including Amazon, Snowflake, Rackspace, and many other prominent players in the database space. I've actually structured this into some slides that we're about to jump into for your reference. And in the description, you can actually make a copy if you ever want to use this for yourself, whether you're an account executive preparing for maybe a deal review to present to your leadership, or maybe you're a technical founder, you've never sold business to business, and you're looking for a visual that would help you organize your information and data as you progress a deal. This is going to be a great resource. Just quickly calling out again who this video is intended for. Obviously, if you're an account executive trying to see how other people run their deals, or maybe you're an SDR right now ultimately trying to promote to account executive, this will give you some great insight as to what is required to close a deal. But also, again, maybe you're learning about a tech sales career, just trying to understand the types of things you should know, or maybe you're a technical founder and you've never really had to sell business to business, or you've never sold a six-figure contract. This will hopefully give you an idea of some of the complexities involved when it's not just a simple transaction and there's a lot of key stakeholders involved. Lastly, if you're curious about what it takes to sell a highly technical, engineering-focused product, maybe you've sold other things in the past, but not software or not an engineering-level software product, I hope you get a lot out of this, and let's move into the agenda for today's video. So let's take a look at the agenda for today. We're going to look at the company that we sold to, and it's worth noting any information or names or logos you see here are completely anonymous. This deal was sold many years in the past, and there's no intention here of leaking any private information, nor would I ever do that on this channel. Two, we're going to take a look at the stakeholders involved, from the CTO all the way down to the engineer and everything in between in terms of who was involved. We're also going to talk in depth about what we heard, and certainly if you're an account executive or an SDR trying to improve your discovery game, you're going to get a lot out of this section. And also, again, if you're that technical founder that has never had to sell to anyone before, I want to show you how we uncovered some very meaningful information that not only allowed us to position ourselves as a great database, but the best choice in a sea of competitors. We'll also talk about our competitors, not just who they were, but how we ultimately positioned ourselves to win against them. And we're going to take a look. I've broken out in a timeline to give you an idea of how long this deal took and some of the major milestones. We're going to look at the major events that happened throughout this deal that ultimately allowed us to secure this six-figure contract. And then in summary, we're going to look at some of the keys to the deal and some of my thoughts in closing to give you an idea of how I might have ran it differently and or some things that I took away and used in future deals myself. So let's take a look at the company. I've clearly just made a random name here, Big Time Commerce. Again, the key being this was just an e-commerce company. That logo that you see there in the top right, I'll move my head for you, is just a generic logo I found on the internet that says e-commerce. But this company helped direct-to-consumer brands. Their focus was on helping people who had direct-to-consumer businesses. Think of like a tea or a protein drink or spices or just random products that you would sell direct-to-consumer. You would actually send them all of your products, and then they would help you list it on Amazon, on Shopify, and of course, they had tons of warehousing space, over 50,000 feet, so they would help you sell that to your consumer and also get it to them rather quickly. They had 3 different warehouses, one on the eastern United States, one in the central US, and one on the West Coast, and that allowed them to house all of your inventory across the entire US and offer same-day or 2-day shipping as well. It's important to note one of the biggest things that caused them to make a change at the database level is that going into the year, they were expecting 400% year-over-year growth. This was in 2020, right as COVID was shutting down the US. And as you know, many people started shopping online at a drastically higher rate than they had before. And again, just pointing out not only their high-level business model, but some of their customers, they really found a niche, especially in selling consumer packaged goods like beverages and food, because in particular with beverages, they are a very dense product that is typically expensive to ship. So you can see some examples of brands I won't name specifically, but they had a very prominent coffee brand, a water brand, and some spice brands as well that they helped ship across the US. And they also really focused on brands that were small to medium size, not enormous brands, but they were really a catalyst to their growth. So obviously, they were very critical to a business's success, let alone making their own business successful. When people partnered with this e-commerce company, they were really taking a huge gamble that their business had to grow exponentially at that point. A few other quick facts here. The company had just raised $14 million in a Series B, and one of the things that I found as we engaged early on is that in their press release on TechCrunch, it was noted that a significant portion of the money was intended to be allocated towards revamping their technology stack. More on that to come. They also had a new CEO in the business, and while we will transition into some of the initial calls we had and what we learned about their business, it's important to note one thing that I found online and confirmed with the CTO when we first spoke on the phone is that through Black Friday to the end of the holiday season, so roughly January 1st, the company in about a month and a half did 80% of their annual revenue. So they were very optimized around the holiday season. They saw a huge spike in sales. And when we initially engaged, it was about mid to end of October, a few weeks, if not just around a month before Black Friday, and they were in sheer panic mode. As we transition to some of those facts as well, I just want to talk about some of the key stakeholders involved. The CTO, again, a fictional name here. We're just going to use Steve as an example. They had a lead engineer, Stephanie, Brandon, who was the VP of engineering, and then Curtis, who was also the CEO. It's important to note that the CTO was the original CTO and co-founder of the business, and he had built the original tech stack himself. So the business had been around roughly 9 to 10 years, and everything that had been built started with the CTO. But they were at this point growing so quickly now as a business that they needed to modernize their tools that were almost 10 years old, and they also needed to do so now through an engineering team as opposed to their very smart and talented CTO. Stephanie had been at the company, and it became very clear early on that she would be the one that would lead the testing of our database. She was by far the most knowledgeable about the database as she had been there for 4 years, but it is worth noting, again, because they were growing so quickly, they had gotten by with rather simple implementations of their software so far. So while she was the expert in-house, no one had truly scaled a database to the scale that they needed it, which is a gap that we'll talk about in much more detail. Brandon was the VP of engineering, also very new to the company and one of the new hires associated with this recent fundraising round, and also the CEO, again, going back to that $14 million Series B. They had been brought in and had proven that they had market fit. And as a business, you'll see this many times where they are growing quickly and they bring in a more professional or experienced CEO that was not on the original founding team to run and grow the business. The last note there before we get into some of the things we heard on our initial conversations is that while the CEO ultimately did sign off on this deal, it was very clear that he was very detached from the technology. His expertise was more in supply chain and logistics than actual technology implementations. So we found very, very quickly that everything more or less went through the CTO, and they really had full autonomy to ultimately make the decision. So the CTO ultimately filled out a demo request towards the end of October for our technology. I realized in doing some research that it was the CTO. They kind of anonymized their data and didn't want to get a bunch of calls and emails from us. But I ultimately found their contact information and I reached out asking what they were trying to build. I'll spare you some of the details, and again, at any point, comment below if you want me to make a future video or a deeper dive on any one of these elements in our agenda. But it's worth noting that the CTO of the company came in and started a demo, which shows you the urgency. Normally, at a company of their size, a lower-level engineer might come in and do a trial. It's very rare to see a CTO come in and fill out a demo request, and actually, I could tell they were actually using the product. So I immediately reached out and we set up a conversation, and this slide here, what we heard, is gonna dive into some of the biggest things we uncovered on our initial conversation. The reason so close to Black Friday that the CTO was testing new databases is that they were already experiencing outages about a month prior to Black Friday. They were growing very quickly as a business, which was great. But like I mentioned, their technology was almost 10 years old. It wasn't built in a way to scale with the amount of customers they were rapidly getting. And I might add, expecting now, because it was the first holiday season after the pandemic, where everyone was largely still staying in their homes and buying everything online. Additionally, their current provider, which I won't name specifically, was really struggling to support them. So they were using a free version of a database and putting it on a company's infrastructure. But that team consistently did not have an answer. They were having outages almost daily, and the support team was unable to resolve those issues. Like I mentioned, they were expecting around Black Friday, again, they were having outages every single day. And this is about a month before Black Friday, where they were expecting 400% more traffic, let alone the traffic that on a daily basis was bringing them down already. It's worth noting, we also uncovered that they didn't really have a dedicated database team on staff, and they were also expecting, at the time, a typical holiday season prior to that year had done 500 to 800 gigabytes of data. They were expecting in a month and a half to be able to need to process and pull analytics from over 4 terabytes of data. And it was very clear that they needed to finalize all of their purchases and be up and running the week before Black Friday, so they would have the best chance of actually being able to sustain the traffic. And I think it's worth noting, if you're new to sales or looking to improve your game, you notice here that I've made a clear distinction between the current state and the pain and the impact. And while these things are very closely related, it's very tempting to talk to a customer and immediately say, well, like, what happens if this isn't fixed? But I think oftentimes when you do that, you'll find people get emotional, they get defensive, and it's really important to make a distinction in your mind that you really need to understand just what everything is today. You just need to understand the current state, if you will, before saying, hey, what is the actual pain of this, or what is the impact of the problems that you're experiencing right now? And as our conversation transitioned more to the pain and the impact here, it was clear that if their database went down, they had to stop what they were doing. They couldn't process orders, but it was really on us as a team to really press them and understand and quantify how painful that truly was. Because sure, outages led to lost revenue. That was a no-brainer. But we had to really probe and understand at a deeper level what that truly meant. And so, for instance, one of the major things that we found is if the system was down for more than 15 minutes, again, they are not only supporting listings on the internet, they are also supporting 3 warehouses across the US with workers in these warehouses. So if the database was down for more than 15 minutes and they didn't realize that, not only would they have to stop everything, so they're paying hourly workers that have to literally freeze in place and can't do anything, they also can't process orders on the internet. And I might add, again, if this went for more than 15 minutes undetected, they would then have to manually go back and retrace all of the inventory that they just moved around in the last 20 minutes. They would have to take it to its original place, rescan in this inventory before they could move forward, because they would have lost track of everything, where it was, how many they sold, the inventory, and now their customers would be getting inaccurate data of how many products they had left and all of these different things. And so again, this is really great information that we got from the CTO, but we really needed to understand at a dollar level, hey, maybe you don't have an exact idea, but this sounds pretty painful. One, I confirmed that this was happening multiple times a day, not just an outage, but I confirmed that they had had an outage that had lasted for 15 minutes or more. And I also had the CTO confide in me that this, especially during Black Friday in their peak season, would be hundreds of thousands of dollars for 15 minutes of downtime. And also, not only just the immediate pain of not being able to process orders, losing customers, and all of these different things, but the brands that they supported. Obviously, if they had a horrible Black Friday and Christmas experience with them, if they lost data or lost orders because the database went down, not only were they losing sales in the moment that the database was down, but the brands that they supported would likely churn and go to a different company because of the poor experience. So we are talking about millions of dollars on the line here. So again, I have made separate videos, and I'm happy to make another video on a deep dive of how to structure a discovery call to get this information in the first place. But towards the end of the call, the CTO was rather forthcoming with the urgency and some of the major pains associated with this issue. But we did also want to make a point to talk about the future state. Hey, if this gets resolved, what does that actually look like? And also, again, I might add, that is separate of trying to quantify what the actual impact is to the business. So one of the biggest things they mentioned was they probably wanted to run fully in Google Cloud. I will say, Amazon, again, was a competitor, but it became very clear that they were leaning that direction anyhow. Obviously, they needed cloud services beyond just the database that could handle the anticipated 400% growth during the holidays. And they also were really lacking database expertise in-house. And I found out that they had actually tried to hire 2 different database engineers over the last 2 years that didn't work out. But at this point, it was now an unavoidable thing. They could no longer get by being pretty good at the database stuff and having a software engineer that had never really focused on the database more or less figure it out. They could no longer get away with doing that, and they needed to have expertise in-house. And also, once they got through the holiday season, while this didn't have a huge impact on the initial win here at this company, they ultimately were planning in the new year, once they got through the holiday rush, to launch a new product that gave some of the brands they supported better insights into their go-to-market strategy, whether it was selling direct to consumer to other major brands, like trying to get their products in Walmart and Target, et cetera, et cetera. And it's worth noting, the future state is also separated from the business outcomes. Some of the major business outcomes, again, obviously the ability to support 400% year-over-year growth, if that was successful, that was great and a huge milestone if they could accomplish it. But clearly, if they were successful there and they were growing this quickly, they would anticipate down the line a further need to scale much more drastically. So not only did we have to convince them that we could be able to handle this 400% year-over-year growth, but we had to convince them that, sure, yes, we'll solve the problem this year, but next year, here's how we do it if you grew 1,000%. Also, I might add, going back to that point of the new product they plan to launch, in addition to the sales for the actual physical goods that they were supporting, this new tool that they plan to launch in the new year would also lead for a potential to grow their revenue drastically by selling a software product in addition to the physical goods. So there was a lot of exponential value if we got this right. Additionally, this broader move was part of their initiative to modernize their entire technical stack, which first and foremost solved their immediate technical problem, but there was also value in working with the latest and greatest tools that allows you to attract really great talent and engineers that want to come work for you in the future. And of course, they had just raised a $14 million Series B, so if they had a really blowout holiday season and really hit that growth metric of 400% year over year, they would be even better positioned for an even higher valuation come Series C, so there was a lot riding on the success of this technical adoption. So by now, you've gotten a sense of some of the major things that were important to the brand. Obviously, they had to do this very quickly, but scale from a technical perspective was one of the most important things that they had to get right to do this successfully. I would say as a very important but maybe secondary issue, there was a real need for in-house expertise, and the support that they were getting from their previous provider was rather horrible. And so whether they hired someone, even if they had the ability to hire someone within a month and leading up to this Black Friday implementation, they still needed to have confidence and really valued expertise, which is something we'll get into here as we look at the competitive overview and the brands we competed against. While I did mention they largely had shown their hand and they really wanted to go to Google Cloud, the one challenge and hangup is that Amazon had a very similar database to what we had on the surface. It looked very similar and was priced significantly cheaper. And I found out that the CTO had already been experimenting with that database. And one of the biggest things that we had to differentiate right out of the gate is that while on the surface, this database did seem a bit faster, if you know anything about technology, or even in the example of your computer, you know how they sell larger and larger compute sizes. They sell more RAM with a computer, more storage. The problem with Amazon in this case is that while the offering looked very similar and they in theory could migrate, the cost would actually be significant when they did hit Black Friday and Christmas because the technology was not fundamentally different than the free database they were already using. It was basically that free database that was hosted in Amazon. There was no technical changes, and all it allowed you to do is just add hardware. So you could just throw more hardware at the problem, and hey, if we have more traffic, we'll just make the compute size bigger, we'll make the storage bigger. But that fundamentally does not solve the problem of you not being able to handle and scale up and down with really bursty and drastic increases in workloads. Lastly, a big theme that we found throughout this entire deal was no expert support, and I'll talk about that in our timeline, but we encourage them to take a look at this Amazon offering because one of the biggest differentiators in addition to this support and the difference in expertise that we had was also fundamentally our product was an enterprise version that had different scaling features that were not available in Amazon. And the CTO, to no fault of their own, was doing so many things at once, they actually hadn't gotten deep enough in the technology to fundamentally understand that. So that is how we positioned ourselves against Amazon, and it's one of the biggest differentiators we had is that we had a component called a database proxy, a story for another time. But this database proxy allowed you to basically run the database in the same way, but it handled a lot of different scaling features and a lot of the things that they didn't have at the time without really having to drastically overhaul their architecture in the first place. We also competed against Snowflake, and I'll make this story rather short. Snowflake is not really a purpose-built database, so they had a few corner and niche use cases that looked good for that future product, but it very quickly became clear that it wasn't a best fit, and ultimately at the end of the day, we were competing against Amazon primarily and also Rackspace on the right side. Rackspace was their current provider. They were having constant outages and challenges, and the support team at Rackspace, while very talented, supports hundreds of product lines. So they also didn't really have in-house expertise to solve our specific database. And what happened is, again, at the end of the day, they basically were also just saying, hey, you could pay more to increase the size of your instance to handle more data, but it fundamentally didn't solve the challenges of scaling that were really the root cause of this issue. So let's take a look at the timeline and how this unfolded. I might add, if you're new to sales, this was one of the faster deals I closed given the deal size. There's no one hard and fast rule here, but I will say deals that are 6 figures and above traditionally take minimally, I would say 3 months to 6 months. But in this case, we had about a month to get this done, and it was because of that Black Friday deadline. They just didn't have a choice. So they had to make the best guess possible, and we had about 3.5 weeks end to end to try and win this deal. So I mentioned the CTO trialed our database, and we had a brief email exchange, which ultimately led to the discovery call the next day. That is where we got a lot of that information on the current state, some of the pains, their future state, and ultimately the outcomes they were striving for. We also had very quickly a second call with the extended team, and this is where we had established how we were differentiated from Amazon and Rackspace and Snowflake, but now it was, hey, we clearly understand this is something you need to solve in a few weeks, so if we are going to test this, what are the actual things you need to see while testing our product that shows you that it's the fit? And we had an entire hour-long call kind of diving into some of the things they wanted to do. They wanted to test production-level data and do a bunch of different chaos tests and all of these things outside the scope of today's video. One of the keys to this deal, in my mind, was as they started a trial, we actually had the creators of our database on our support team. So we had some of the original members, some of the engineers that were still building the product, and we very quickly, and I would say atypically from a normal deal, introduced some of our best support resources right out of the gate, which not only allowed us to build rapport with the team, but ultimately also allowed us to strategically position our highest level of support in the deal itself. So not only were we positioning the database, but we also increased the contract value by positioning our highest level of support. And we started, again, earlier than we normally would for many customers. We started an engagement with the CTO, with some of the engineers that were contributing directly to the product so they would have a great experience while testing our database. So we're moving at the speed of light here. We had a quick check-in, and we also presented our first formal proposal and engaged with Google Cloud, who we ultimately partnered with to sell this deal. One note here, again, if you're newer to sales or an AE, I think in this case it was really good to get pricing out in the open. While we did have a lot of urgency and they needed to buy something in any case, just being transparent with them, getting pricing in front of them out of the gate, not only served as a way for us to know if our pricing was in line with their expectation, but it also allowed us to open up conversations around how our competitors were pricing themselves. And not every customer is going to give you that information, but in our case, that was a huge thing we used towards the end of the deal to also negotiate against competitors that were pricing themselves a little bit less expensive. We still positioned the value and the overall vision of the product that they were buying, and it became a no-brainer when compared to something that on the surface looked cheaper, but really was a significantly less valuable product for them. So I'm gonna breeze through some of these points as well. Again, this is intended to give you just more of an overview of how some of these things went. If you've never seen the term POC, by the way, it is proof of concept, or just an acronym we use for testing the product itself. We had a couple check-ins throughout the week, and we were making a lot of progress to get this ready. And by the 12th of November, again, really, really close now to Black Friday and the holiday season, we actually set up a production test, and they tested while in a trial phase, which is usually not something you're allowed to do. They actually tested our database in production and actually processed orders, processed inventory through our database to actually validate some of the things that, again, going back to when we set the actual testing criteria, when we did this test on the 12th, we actually had very clear criteria and very clear things that they were going to do to test it, which we then discussed on Monday, and we had a lot of great results. We had to move quickly. There were a few formal things at that point. When we got the all clear in terms of testing on Monday, we sent them the proposal, the final proposal on Tuesday. We had a few follow-up conversations, and the CTO signed on the next day, on Wednesday. On the 18th, we ultimately went live and really started running. We had about a week left until Black Friday. So I know I breezed through this deal review, and there's a lot of things that would either warrant a separate video of itself, or if I truly talked about this deal at the length it requires to explain every detail, this could honestly be a 2-hour video. but I do want to summarize some of the keys to the deal here that, again, if you're an account executive, if you're an SDR, or you're a technical founder and maybe just trying to better understand the things that you can do to really better position yourself and win more often than you lose, one of the biggest things we had out of the gate was executive alignment. And not only that, not just the CTO himself that was there and obviously talking and testing and putting his hands on the product, but it's worth noting this was obviously the #1 priority of the company. And I say this because there's been a lot of times at any company that I've worked at where you can have a great database in this example that solves their problem, but if it's a nice to have, or if everything is largely, for the most part, working, it's very hard to prioritize that over something, again, going back to a strength that we had in this deal. Unfortunately, at the time, their database was crashing all the time. So in this case, it was by far the #1 priority. Their business could not run if their database was down, which in this case was a great help, but where some deals, you really have to work the executive side to get on their priority list. In this case, we were obviously a priority, but what that meant is because we were the #1 priority, instead of having to work our way into the account, convince them that it was important, it was very clear the challenge for us on this deal was going to be positioning ourselves against our competitor, right? And again, only if this is the #1 priority and you know for a fact they're going to make a purchase, can you really invest the amount of time we did into actually differentiating yourself from your competitors. And again, credit to our entire team on this deal. The engineering side of this was a key win for us because, again, on the surface, our competitors that I mentioned prior, for the most part, looked like a cheaper and equivalent solution. We actually had the expertise in-house. Our support team and our engineers were able to engage with the CTO at a very deep level, and we were able to articulate some of the most major problems that they had with their architecture, and also specifically tying that to the unique features that our database had compared to the other competitors. And that was something we had actually established borderline at the end of our first call, and very clearly as we got into some of the testing requirements, we positioned and very clearly articulated why we were different, and in this case, much better. And that is, from a technical side, something that consistently drove home how great of a fit we were, and also tied into the really great support experience they had, which allowed us to also sell a very premium support package on top of the software itself. And again, if you're a rep right now, I know sometimes you really have to fight for internal resources, and thankfully I've had a great experience at every company I've worked for. But I will say, in this case, this deal, when you come to your team out of nowhere and say, I have a 100K deal plus that's gonna close in 3.5 weeks, a lot of the times they get very skeptical, and naturally so. It's not very often that you have someone that's willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a moment's notice. And one of the things that you'll see, and if you've been in sales, or again, if you're that founder that has maybe been burned in the past, it's really tempting sometimes when you get prospects that are very eager, very excited to test your technology, and yet you give them a trial, and once you give them the trial, they don't actually follow through and they don't actually buy. So again, this was another big shout out to our team who really understood the urgency and the impact of what we were doing and allowed us to break kind of some unwritten rules internally, allowing us to get some of our best engineering resources engaged in the deal very early on. And I think, again, throughout this entire deal, and I'm happy to, if you have any questions in the comments or otherwise, I'm happy to explain some of these features in more depth and or make a follow-up video. But the support we offered throughout the engagement of this deal was a key differentiator for us without question. While the Amazon solution in this example was not as costly, it was easier to get started with, they really did not have that much support outside of the sales team at Amazon. And that was a huge differentiator for us because, again, going back to an earlier point, we had some of our best engineers helping on a day-to-day basis, responding almost in real time. And lastly, just reiterating again from a selfishly sales standpoint, this high level of engagement allowed us to increase the deal size by including the highest level of support along with the software. But if you made it this far, I obviously appreciate it. And if you got a lot of value out of the video, we'd appreciate a subscribe. There is a link to this slideshow in the description if you want to copy it and use it for your own reference. And I'd also add, there's many things here for the sake of time. I know this video, all said and done, is probably going to be over 30 minutes. I had to leave a lot of things out, and I'm happy to make a follow-up deeper dive video if that's of interest. So if there's anything you want me to answer in the comments below, any future video topics you'd like me to make, let me know. But appreciate your time as always, and we'll see you in the next video.